On a grey afternoon, the millionaire enters through the side gate, adjusting his coat while wiping sweat from his forehead. Near the lawn, a gentle-eyed German shepherd is pulled by a security guard to a hidden corner. On the other side of the fence, a baby in its mother's arms follows every movement without blinking. Silently, the man signals for the guard to take the animal to the back. A short bark escapes through a crack in the wall and is lost among the trees. The millionaire's car reverses and disappears behind the tall gates. The guard raises the chain and rests his hand on the dog's collar. But the baby's cry unexpectedly cuts through the night. Do you love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thank you for following us. Now back to our story. From the moment Richard Blackstone erected those towering stone walls and installed cameras at every corner of his estate, his name became the whispered topic behind drawn curtains throughout the quiet streets of Millbrook Heights. Few knew how he had accumulated such wealth in such a short time, but everyone felt the weight of his presence in every tree trimmed without warning, in every section of sidewalk that seemed to belong more to the mansion than to the neighborhood itself. The exclusive California community had always prided itself on discretion and elegance, where Mediterranean-style homes sat gracefully behind manicured hedges and where the sound of children playing echoed softly through tree-lined streets. But since Blackstone's arrival 3 years ago, an invisible tension had settled over Willowbrook Lane, like morning fog that refused to lift. Margaret O'Brien, known to everyone as Maggie, had worked as the estate's head housekeeper for over 20 years, since before Blackstone purchased the property from the elderly Pemberton family. She remembered when the house had been filled with laughter, dinner parties, and the gentle chaos of grandchildren visiting during summers. Now, the vast rooms echoed with the hollow sound of her footsteps and the occasional bark of security radios. Despite all the rigid control that governed every aspect of the estate, one detail consistently escaped Blackstone's absolute authority. A German shepherd named Max, with a strong build and gentle eyes, who stubbornly ignored the walls and found gaps to venture onto the sidewalks. The dog would sniff the newly planted flowers, chase leaves dancing in the California breeze, and most importantly, stop in front of a blue gate where, in the arms of a young mother, a baby would smile at the sight of his snout pressed against the iron bars. Sarah Mitchell had moved to Millbrook Heights 8 months ago with her 18-month-old daughter Emma, hoping to find peace after her divorce. The small cottage with the distinctive blue gate had been all she could afford in the prestigious neighborhood, but Emma's delighted giggles whenever Max appeared made every sacrifice worthwhile. The baby's face would light up like sunshine, her tiny hands reaching through the gate bars to touch the dog's soft fur. Every morning, Blackstone observed from his highest window as the dog crossed the expensive lawn as if he owned that patch of carefully maintained grass. The irritation grew silently, first in glances, then in curt orders to security guards to better secure the perimeter. But Max seemed to always find a breach, as if the very concept of boundaries was foreign to his nature. Jake Harrison, the head of security, had worked for wealthy clients before, but none quite like Blackstone. The man's obsession with control extended beyond normal privacy concerns. Jake often found himself checking and rechecking fence lines, reviewing camera footage for the slightest anomaly, and fielding increasingly agitated calls from his employer about the German shepherd's daily escapes. The neighborhood, accustomed to silencing itself before Blackstone's imposing presence, began to notice that he spent more time hunched over security monitors than attending to his business affairs. When Max ventured out to play, it was as if the heavy routine of the neighborhood lightened for a few precious minutes, especially for the exhausted mother who watched her baby laugh at the simple joy of extending her little hand toward the soft, fur. Mrs. Henderson, who lived 2 houses down, often paused during her morning walks to watch the interaction. "That dog brings more joy to this street than all of Blackstone's renovations combined," she confided to her husband one evening. The sentiment was shared quietly among neighbors who had grown weary of the constant construction noise, the security, patrols, and the general atmosphere of surveillance that had descended over their once peaceful community. Blackstone's empire, built through aggressive real estate acquisitions and development projects across Southern California, demanded his constant attention. Phone calls came at all hours, demanding decisions about zoning permits, construction delays, and investor meetings. Yet increasingly, he found himself distracted by the sight of Max roaming freely, a living reminder that not everything in his domain could be controlled. The German Shepherd had originally belonged to the estate's former groundskeeper, an elderly man named Frank, who had been dismissed abruptly when Blackstone took over. Frank had pleaded to take Max with him, but Blackstone had insisted the dog stay, claiming it was part of the property's security. What he hadn't anticipated was Max's independent spirit and his natural tendency to seek companionship beyond the mansion's walls. Maggie remembered Frank well. He had taught her about the property's history, about the gardens that had been replanted 3 times, about the original foundation that had required unexpected repairs. Most importantly, he had shared stories about the land itself, about boundary disputes that had been settled decades ago, about promises made and forgotten. When Frank left, he had pressed a small key into Maggie's hand, muttering something about keeping the truth safe until it was needed. The key had sat in Maggie's jewelry box for 3 years, forgotten among her modest collection of earrings and her late mother's rosary. She had assumed it belonged to some garden shed or storage room that no longer existed. But recently, watching Blackstone's increasing agitation over Max's freedom, she found herself thinking about Frank's cryptic words. As autumn settled over Millbrook Heights, the tension in the Blackstone estate grew thicker than the marine layer that rolled in from the Pacific each evening. The staff moved with quiet efficiency, speaking in hushed tones, always aware that their employer's mood had grown increasingly volatile. Phone calls behind closed doors grew longer and more heated, often ending with the sharp crack of receivers being slammed down. Sarah had begun to notice changes too. The security patrols had increased, and she often saw guards walking the perimeter with flashlights even during daylight hours. But Max continued his daily visits, seemingly oblivious to the growing storm clouds gathering around the estate. Each afternoon, Emma would position herself by the blue gate, babbling in her wordless language that somehow Max seemed to understand perfectly. The dog had an uncanny ability to appear precisely when Emma needed comfort. On days when she was fussing from teething pain, Max would settle quietly by the gate, his calm presence soothing her cries. When she was excited and energetic, he would pace playfully along the fence line, making her laugh with his gentle antics. It was as if he had appointed himself as her guardian, despite the walls and cameras designed to keep him contained. One particularly crisp October morning, as golden leaves drifted down from the neighborhood's oak trees, Blackstone made a decision that would set into motion a chain of events no one could have predicted. Standing at his office window, watching Max once again escape through what appeared to be a perfectly secure fence line, he reached for his phone and dialed Jake's number. "I want that dog contained permanently," he said without preamble. "Whatever it takes. I'm tired of this disruption to security protocols. Find out how he's getting out and seal every possible exit. If he's becoming a liability, then we need to address it immediately." Jake hesitated, understanding the implications of his employer's increasingly authoritarian tone. "Sir, the dog isn't really causing any harm. He just likes to visit the neighbors." "That dog represents a failure in our security system," Blackstone replied coldly. "If we can't control a German shepherd, what does that say about our ability to protect this property? Handle it, Jake. Today." As the call ended, neither man realized they were being overheard. Maggie had been polishing the silver in the adjacent dining room, and Blackstone's raised voice had carried through the thin walls of the mansion's hurried renovations. For the first time in 3 years, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the California weather, and her fingers instinctively moved to touch the small key hidden in her apron pocket. That humid afternoon brought the breaking point that everyone had sensed was coming. Jake Harrison stood at the estate's side gate, checking the latch mechanism for the 3rd time that day, when he discovered what he had been dreading to find. The gate had been deliberately damaged, not by Max's escape attempts, but by someone with tools and knowledge of the property's weak points. The scratches around the lock were fresh, made by someone who understood exactly how the security system worked. Jake's mind raced through the possibilities. Only a handful of people had access to the estate's blueprints and security protocols. His phone buzzed with another call. From Blackstone, but for the first time in his 2 years of employment, Jake let it ring. Meanwhile, Maggie moved through the mansion's corridors with practiced silence, but her thoughts were anything but calm. She had watched Jake's investigation from the kitchen window and recognized the look of a man caught between loyalty and conscience. The morning's overheard conversation replayed in her mind as she dusted furniture that didn't need dusting, straightened paintings that hung perfectly straight, and tried to convince herself that her growing unease was just imagination. The key in her pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Frank's words echoed in her memory, keeping the truth safe. Until it was needed. At the time, she had assumed he was being dramatic, perhaps bitter about his dismissal. But now, 3 years later, she wondered if the old groundskeeper had known something that the rest of them were only beginning to sense. Across the neighborhood, Sarah Mitchell secured Emma in her stroller for their afternoon walk, unaware that this simple routine would soon become the catalyst for everything that followed. Emma babbled excitedly as they approached the blue gate, her little hands already reaching toward the spot where Max usually appeared. But today, the street felt different, quieter, charged with an tension that even a toddler could sense. Henry Walsh, the retired contractor who lived at the end of Willowbrook Lane, paused in his gardening as he noticed the increased security activity around the Blackstone estate. At 73, Henry had seen enough neighborhood changes to recognize when trouble was brewing. His connection to the property ran deeper than most residents knew. 40 years ago, as a young carpenter, he had worked on the original foundation repairs that had been necessary after the house's initial construction. Those repairs had been extensive, requiring excavation that revealed inconsistencies in the property's surveyed boundaries. Henry remembered the heated discussions between the original owners, the Pemberton family, and the neighboring property owners about where exactly the lot lines should be drawn. Compromises had been made, papers had been signed, but Henry had always wondered if all the documentation had been properly filed with the county. The memories stirred uncomfortably as he watched Jake pace the perimeter with increasing agitation. Henry had kept quiet about those long-ago construction details, respecting the privacy that had always defined Millbrook Heights. But Blackstone's aggressive expansion of the estate, the way property lines seemed to shift subtly each year, made him question whether his silence had been the right choice. Back at the estate, Max had managed another escape, but this time his usual playful demeanor was replaced by something more urgent. Instead of his leisurely exploration of the neighborhood, he headed directly to a specific spot in the mansion's extensive gardens, a corner where the original foundation met a newer addition. He began digging with determined intensity, his powerful paws throwing dirt in steady rhythms. Maggie noticed the commotion from the conservatory windows. She had seen Max dig before, but never with such focused purpose. Something about his behavior reminded her of Frank's old stories about the dog's uncanny ability to find things that were lost. Frank used to joke that Max was better than a metal detector, always uncovering garden tools, sprinkler fittings, or forgotten toys that had been buried by time and weather. Jake's radio crackled with Blackstone's voice, demanding an immediate update on the security breach. The term seemed dramatically excessive for a friendly dog's afternoon adventures, but Jake had learned not to question his employer's increasingly paranoid perspective. As he approached Max's digging site, intending to redirect the dog back toward the house, something metallic caught his eye in the disturbed earth. The object was small, covered in decades of soil and rust, but unmistakably man-made. Jake's security training kicked in. Anything unusual on the property needed to be reported immediately, but as he knelt to examine the find more closely, an instinct warned him to proceed carefully. The object appeared to be an old surveyor's marker, the kind used to establish property boundaries in earlier decades. Sarah reached the blue gate just as Max abandoned his digging project and trotted over to greet Emma. The baby's delighted squeals filled the afternoon air, a sound so pure and joyful that several neighbors paused in their activities to smile. But Sarah noticed that Jake was standing in the garden, staring at something in his hands with an expression that seemed troubled rather than curious. The security guard looked up and caught Sarah's eye through the fence. For a moment, they simply regarded each other, two people who had never spoken but who shared the daily witness of Emma and Max's friendship. Jake's expression suggested he wanted to say something, but the sound of approaching footsteps made him quickly pocket whatever he had found and move away from the disturbed earth. Blackstone emerged from the house with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to immediate solutions to any problem. His expensive suit was slightly wrinkled from hours spent hunched over legal documents, and his usually perfect hair showed signs of frustrated hands running through it. The phone calls from investors had grown more demanding, and the last thing he needed was a security issue to complicate his already precarious business situation. "Where is that animal?" he demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. Jake gestured toward the blue gate, where Max was now sitting peacefully beside Emma's stroller, accepting gentle pats from the toddler's small hands. The sight should have been charming, but Blackstone's face darkened with irritation. "Sir, I think we need to discuss the property boundaries," Jake said carefully. "I found something that might require attention from the legal department." He pulled the surveyor's marker from his pocket, its brass surface still bearing faint markings despite years of burial. Blackstone's reaction was immediate and telling. His face went pale, then flushed with what appeared to be anger. But Jake recognized it as something closer to fear. "Where exactly did you find that?" The question was sharp, urgent, lacking any pretense of casual interest. "Near the foundation where the dog was digging. Sir, if this is an original boundary marker, it might indicate that some of our recent property improvements have extended beyond the legal limits." Jake's security background had taught him to identify problems before they became crises, but Blackstone's response suggested they might already be past that point. The mansion's owner snatched the marker from Jake's hand, examining it with the intensity of a man whose entire world might depend on a piece of corroded brass. "This is old, probably meaningless. The property was properly surveyed when I purchased it. All documents were filed correctly." But his voice lacked conviction, and Jake noticed the slight tremor in his hands. From her position at the conservatory window, Maggie watched the exchange with growing understanding. Frank's mysterious key suddenly seemed less like the relic of a bitter old man and more like the tool to unlock secrets that someone had worked very hard to bury. The truth that Frank had spoken of wasn't just about the property. It was about the foundation upon which Blackstone's entire empire had been built. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Millbrook Heights, the three people who would soon hold the keys to unraveling everything stood in their separate positions. Jake with his growing suspicions, Maggie with her inherited secrets, and Sarah with her innocent baby who had somehow become the catalyst for exposing what had been hidden for so long. None of them yet understood the full scope of what was beginning to unfold, but each felt the unmistakable sensation that their quiet neighborhood was about to change forever. The only constant was Max, still sitting contentedly by the blue gate, as if he understood that his work was just beginning. The confusion that erupted in the garden became the first crack in what would eventually bring down Richard Blackstone's carefully constructed facade. That evening, as Maggie prepared the mansion for another night of her employer's increasingly erratic behavior, she made a decision that would change everything. The small key that had rested forgotten in her jewelry box for 3 years suddenly felt like the most important object in her world. Blackstone had spent the remainder of the afternoon making frantic phone calls to lawyers, demanding immediate reviews of property documents and threatening anyone who suggested there might be irregularities in his land acquisition. His voice carried through the mansion's thin walls, a constant stream of demands, denials, and barely controlled panic that confirmed Maggie's growing suspicions that something was fundamentally wrong. After ensuring that Blackstone had retired, to his study with his usual evening scotch and stack of financial reports, Maggie made her way to the mansion's basement. The key had always nagged at her. Frank had been too deliberate, too insistent that it would be needed when the time was right. Now, with property markers surfacing from the garden and her employer's obvious distress, she finally understood that the time had come. The basement had been renovated along with the rest of the house, but Frank had mentioned a small storage room that predated Blackstone's ownership. Behind a wall of expensive wine storage, Maggie found what she was looking for, an old wooden door, painted over multiple times but still bearing the brass lock that matched her key perfectly. Inside the forgotten room, covered by dust cloths and forgotten by time, sat a collection of metal filing cabinets that had been left behind during the estate's transition between owners. The Pemberton family had lived in the house for 60 years, and apparently not all of their records had made the journey to their new residence. Maggie's hands trembled as she opened the first drawer, revealing manila folders filled with documents that spanned decades of property ownership. Meanwhile, Jake Harrison sat in his security office, staring at the images cycling through the surveillance monitors. The cameras showed a peaceful neighborhood settling into evening routines, but his mind kept returning to Blackstone's reaction to the surveyor's marker. In his 2 years of employment, he had never seen his boss lose composure so completely. The incident suggested that whatever irregularities existed with the property went far deeper than simple paperwork errors. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "The old storage room in the basement, tonight. Come alone." Jake stared at the message, recognizing that someone inside the estate was reaching out to him. His security training warned against unauthorized meetings, but his growing unease about his employer's business practices made him consider the risk worth taking. Sarah Mitchell tucked Emma into her crib, still smiling at the memory of her daughter's joy during their afternoon encounter with Max. The baby had babbled excitedly all evening, pointing toward the window that faced the Blackstone estate, as if she expected her furry friend to appear at any moment. But Sarah's maternal instincts had picked up on the tension that had surrounded their usual playtime. Something had shifted in the neighborhood's carefully maintained tranquility. As she prepared for bed, Sarah noticed unusual activity at the mansion. Lights moving through rooms that were typically dark, the silhouette of someone searching through what appeared to be storage areas. Her cottage's position gave her an unobstructed view of the estate's rear sections, and she found herself watching with growing curiosity as the mysterious search continued. In the basement storage room, Maggie had discovered files that made her stomach clench with understanding. The documents revealed a complex history of property disputes, boundary adjustments, and legal settlements that painted a very different picture from the straightforward purchase that Blackstone claimed. Original surveys from the 1960s showed property lines that differed significantly from the current configuration, and correspondence between lawyers suggested that several neighboring lots had been acquired through questionable means. Most disturbing were the handwritten notes in the margins of various documents, apparently made by someone tracking the discrepancies over time. The handwriting looked familiar, Frank's careful script documenting irregularities that he had obviously discovered during his 20 years as the estate's groundskeeper. His notes suggested that Blackstone's expansion of the property had involved forged documents and fraudulent surveys. Jake's footsteps echoed softly in the basement corridor as he followed the mysterious text message's instructions. He found Maggie surrounded by scattered papers, her face pale in the harsh fluorescent light of the storage room. Neither spoke for a moment, each recognizing in the other someone who had reached the same uncomfortable conclusions about their employer. "How long have you known?" Jake asked quietly, gesturing to the documents spread across a folding table. "I didn't know anything until tonight," Maggie replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Frank left me a key before he was dismissed. He said I would know when to use it. I think he suspected what we're seeing here, but he needed someone to discover it who couldn't be dismissed as a disgruntled former employee." Jake examined the papers she handed him, his security background helping him understand the implications immediately. Property fraud was a federal offense, and the scale suggested in these documents would involve millions of dollars and multiple victims. This explains why he's been so paranoid about the property boundaries. If any of this becomes public knowledge, his entire empire could collapse, Maggie finished. Everything he's built has been funded by these fraudulent acquisitions. The mansion, the business ventures, all of it is built on stolen land. Outside, Henry Walsh couldn't sleep. The day's events had stirred memories he had tried to forget, and finally, at midnight, he made a decision. Pulling on his jacket, he walked slowly down Willowbrook Lane to Sarah's cottage. Light still showed in her kitchen window, and when she answered his gentle knock, he saw his own troubled expression reflected in her face. "I need to tell someone what I know about that property," Henry said without preamble. "I worked on the original construction 40 years ago, and things were never quite right with the boundary lines. I kept quiet because it wasn't my business, but if what I suspect is happening..." Sarah invited him in, sensing that the elderly man's visit was connected to the afternoon's strange events. As Henry began describing the construction irregularities he had witnessed decades earlier, Sarah found herself thinking about Emma's innocent friendship with Max and wondering how many other victims there might be of Blackstone's apparent deception. Back in the mansion's basement, Maggie and Jake continued their careful examination of Frank's hidden archive. Each document revealed another layer of the conspiracy: forged signatures on property transfers, surveys that had been altered after the fact, and correspondence suggesting that local officials had been bribed to overlook obvious discrepancies. "We need to get these documents to someone who can act on them," Jake said, photographing pages with his phone. "But we have to be careful. If Blackstone realizes what we've found, he'll destroy everything and disappear," Maggie agreed. Frank was smart to hide these here. He knew that eventually someone would need proof of what really happened. Or dream. As they worked in the basement's shadowy confines, neither Maggie nor Jake noticed the small camera that Blackstone had recently installed in the storage areas. In his study above, their employer sat frozen before his security monitors, watching. His two most trusted employees uncovered the secrets he had spent years burying. The documents they were discovering represented more than just property fraud. They were evidence of a systematic pattern of deception that had destroyed families, stolen inheritances, and corrupted local government officials. Frank's careful documentation showed that Blackstone's wealth wasn't the result of business acumen, but of elaborate theft disguised as legitimate real estate transactions. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. In the final filing cabinet, Maggie discovered a folder marked with the current date, evidence that Blackstone's fraudulent activities were ongoing and that their own neighborhood was his latest target. The plans outlined in the documents would displace dozens of families, all based on forged property claims that no one had thought to question. As dawn approached over Millbrook Heights, the small group of people who had stumbled onto the truth were about to discover that knowledge carried a price. Blackstone's reaction to their investigation would test not only their courage, but their commitment to justice, and the peaceful neighborhood would never be the same. The German shepherd Max, sleeping peacefully in his corner of the estate, remained unaware that his simple desire for friendship had set in motion events that would expose decades of deception and forever change the lives of everyone involved. The morning sun had barely crested the hills surrounding Millbrook Heights when Richard Blackstone made his move. The security footage from the basement had shown him everything he needed to know. His carefully constructed empire was under attack from within his own household. But instead of the explosive confrontation that Maggie and Jake expected, Blackstone chose a more calculated approach. "I'm implementing new security protocols effective immediately," he announced to Jake during their morning briefing. His voice, controlled, but carrying an undertone that made the security chief's blood run cold. "All staff members will be subject to enhanced monitoring, and any unauthorized access to restricted areas will result in immediate termination and potential legal action." Jake nodded professionally, but internally he was calculating how much time they had before Blackstone discovered the extent of their investigation. The copied documents were safely stored on his personal phone, but getting them to the right authorities would require careful planning. Blackstone's connections in local government were extensive, and not all of them could be trusted to act ethically. Meanwhile, Maggie went about her morning routine with practiced normalcy, but every interaction with her employer felt charged with dangerous tension. When Blackstone requested breakfast in his study rather than the dining room, she recognized it as a sign that he was preparing for something significant. Through 20 years of service, she had learned to read his moods like weather patterns, and today's atmosphere promised a storm. Sarah Mitchell was pushing Emma's stroller through the neighborhood park when she noticed the man watching her. From a bench near the playground, he was perhaps 40 years old, casually dressed, with the observant eyes of someone accustomed to noticing details that others missed. When he approached with a unfriendly smile, she instinctively moved closer to her daughter. "Excuse me, but you live on Willowbrook Lane, don't you?" the man asked, producing a business card from his jacket pocket. "I'm Tom Bradley from the Millbrook Community Reporter. I'm working on a story about neighborhood development, and I was hoping to ask you a few questions about the changes in your area." Sarah accepted the card cautiously. The Community Reporter was a small local paper that focused on municipal issues and rarely attracted much attention. But something in Tom's demeanor suggested this wasn't a routine neighborhood interest piece. "What kind of changes are you interested in?" she asked. "Property expansions, zoning irregularities, that sort of thing, Tom replied carefully. I've received some anonymous tips suggesting there might be issues with recent development projects in your neighborhood. Have you noticed anything unusual? Before Sarah could respond, her attention was caught by the sight of Max trotting across the park toward them. The German Shepherd's appearance was unexpected. The estate's enhanced security should have prevented any escapes. But Max seemed unusually agitated, circling around Sarah's stroller and whining softly as if trying to communicate something urgent. Tom watched the interaction with professional interest. Is that the dog from the Blackstone estate? I've heard. He's quite friendly with the neighborhood children. How do you know about Max? Sarah asked, her protective instincts sharpening. The journalist's knowledge seemed too specific for casual neighborhood research. Part of my investigation, Tom admitted. I've been looking into Richard Blackstone's business practices for several months. The anonymous tips I mentioned specifically mentioned unusual activity around the estate, including concerns about property boundaries and legal documentation. Sarah found herself studying Tom's face, trying to gauge his trustworthiness. Emma was reaching toward Max with delighted babbles, seemingly oblivious to the adult tension surrounding her. The dog's presence felt like a sign, though Sarah couldn't articulate exactly what it meant. If I were to hypothetically have information relevant to your investigation, she said carefully, what would you do with it? Verify it through multiple sources, contact appropriate authorities, and ensure that any story published serves the public interest rather than personal vendettas. Tom replied without hesitation. I'm not interested in sensationalism. I'm interested in truth. Back at the estate, Henry Walsh had arrived for an unscheduled visit that Blackstone couldn't easily refuse without appearing suspicious. The elderly contractor claimed to be concerned about foundation settling in his own home and wanted to discuss the soil conditions in the neighborhood. But his real purpose was to observe Blackstone's demeanor and confirm his growing suspicions about the property's fraudulent acquisition. I was just remembering the work we did here back in the 70s, Henry said conversationally as Blackstone led him through the mansion's main floor. Complex foundation repair, if I recall correctly. Had to dig pretty deep to reach stable ground. Found all sorts of interesting things buried in that soil. Blackstone's reaction was subtle but telling. A slight tightening around his eyes. A pause that lasted a fraction of a second too long. I'm sure the previous owners dealt with any issues thoroughly. All the property records were in perfect order when I purchased the estate. Oh, I'm sure they were, Henry agreed, but his tone carried a weight that made Blackstone glance at him sharply. It's just that sometimes records don't tell the whole story. Sometimes the real truth is buried deeper than anyone expects. In the mansion's kitchen, Maggie was preparing lunch when her phone buzzed with a text message. Park bench in 15 minutes. Come alone. She recognized Jake's number and understood that their investigation had reached a critical juncture. Whatever Blackstone was planning, it was happening soon. The clandestine meeting in the park brought together all the players who had stumbled onto different pieces of the truth. Jake arrived first, followed by Maggie, then Sarah with Emma and Max trailing behind. Tom Bradley watched from a distance until Jake gestured for him to join the group. We have a problem, Jake began without preamble. Blackstone knows we've been in the storage room. He's implementing new security measures, and I think he's preparing to destroy the evidence we found. How much time do we have? Maggie asked. Maybe hours. Definitely not days. Jake looked around the group, recognizing that they had become unlikely allies in a situation none of them had anticipated. The documents we discovered prove systematic, fraud going back decades, but we need to get them to people who can act on them before Blackstone can cover his tracks. Tom had been recording the conversation on his phone, but now he put the device away and leaned forward intently. I can get this information to the right authorities, but I need more than copied documents. I need witnesses willing to go on record, and I need corroborating evidence that can't be dismissed as fabrication. I can provide historical context, Henry offered. I've kept my own records of the construction work from 40 years ago. They show discrepancies that support what you found in those files. Sarah bounced Emma gently, thinking about the implications of what she was hearing. If this fraud has been going on for decades, how many other families have been affected? How many people lost their homes because of forged documents? According to what we found, at least 30 families in this county alone, Maggie replied, quietly. Some of them elderly people who couldn't afford to fight legal battles, others who trusted the system to protect them and were wrong. Max had been sitting quietly beside Emma's stroller, but suddenly he stood and looked toward the estate with alert attention. The group followed his gaze and saw several vehicles pulling into the mansion's driveway, black SUVs with government plates that suggested Blackstone was calling in powerful favors to protect himself. "He's moving faster than we expected," Jake observed grimly. "Those could be federal marshals, but more likely they're private security with connections to help him disappear evidence." Tom was already dialing his phone, calling contacts at the county prosecutor's office and the state attorney general's office. If we can get legitimate law enforcement involved immediately, we might be able to preserve the evidence before Blackstone can destroy it. But as they watched from the park, it became clear that time was running out faster than any of them had anticipated. The peaceful neighborhood of Millbrook Heights was about to become the center of a scandal that would reach into city halls, courthouses, and corporate boardrooms throughout Southern California. Emma's innocent laughter as she played with Max seemed to underscore the stakes involved, not just property fraud, but the destruction of communities, the displacement of families, and the corruption of systems that were supposed to protect ordinary citizens from exactly this kind of predatory behavior. The small group in the park realized they were no longer just uncovering a local crime. They were exposing a network of corruption that had operated with impunity for decades, and the people responsible would not give up their power without a fight. As the investigation intensified, Richard Blackstone revealed the lengths to which he would go to protect his empire. The black SUVs that had arrived at the estate belonged not to federal agents, but to a private security firm specializing in what they euphemistically called reputation management. Their real expertise lay in making problems disappear through intimidation, bribery, and legal manipulation. Tom Bradley's contacts in law enforcement had taken his evidence seriously, but the wheels of justice moved slowly compared to the speed at which Blackstone was mobilizing his defenses. Within hours of the park meeting, each member of their informal alliance received visits that made clear how much power they were opposing. Maggie was the first to experience Blackstone's new approach. Instead of firing her outright, which would have seemed suspicious, he called her into his study and presented her with an envelope containing more money than she had ever seen. 20 years of loyal service deserves recognition, he said with a smile that never reached his eyes. This is a bonus for your discretion regarding household matters that might be misunderstood by outsiders. The housekeeper stared at the check, understanding immediately what was being offered and what was being demanded in return. "Mr. Blackstone, I appreciate your generosity, but I don't think I can accept this." "Of course you can," he replied, his tone becoming slightly harder. "In fact, I insist. Along with the bonus comes a new employment contract that includes enhanced confidentiality agreements, very standard in households like ours, where privacy is paramount." Maggie recognized the trap being set. Accepting the money would make her complicit in his cover-up, while refusing it would mark her as an active threat. "I'll need to review the contract carefully before making any decisions." "Naturally, but don't take too long. These generous terms might not be available indefinitely." Jake's encounter was more direct. Blackstone's new security team conducted what they called a comprehensive review of his performance, which involved accessing his personal phone, computer, and financial records. The intrusion was presented as routine updating of security clearances, but Jake understood it was really an investigation to determine how much he knew and what evidence he might have gathered. "Impressive dedication to your duties," commented the team leader, a man whose expensive suit couldn't disguise his military bearing. "Your employer speaks very highly of your loyalty." Of course, loyalty in this business sometimes requires making difficult choices about what information needs to be protected. Jake maintained his professional demeanor while inwardly calculating how long it would take them to discover the copied documents on his phone. "I've always taken my confidentiality obligations seriously." "Good to hear. Mr. Blackstone is prepared to offer substantial recognition for employees who understand the value of discretion. A promotion, salary increase, maybe even assistance with that mortgage on your apartment in Santa Monica." The specific mention of his home address wasn't accidental. Jake realized they had investigated him thoroughly enough to know his financial vulnerabilities and geographic location. The message was clear. Cooperation would be rewarded, but resistance would be costly. Sarah Mitchell's intimidation came in the form of a visit from someone claiming to represent the Homeowners Association. The woman was professionally dressed and carried official-looking documents, but something about her demeanor suggested she had never been involved in neighborhood governance. "We've received complaints about noise violations and unauthorized gatherings in common areas," the woman explained, standing on Sarah's doorstep while Emma napped inside. "There are also concerns about unsupervised interactions between residents and animals from neighboring properties." Sarah frowned, understanding that her afternoon meetings with Max were somehow being characterized as violations. "I wasn't aware that talking to a neighbor's dog required association approval. All interactions between properties are subject to community guidelines, especially when they involve potential liability issues. However, these complaints could be resolved if you were willing to sign an agreement acknowledging the association's authority over such matters." The document thrust into Sarah's hands was dense with legal language, but she caught enough to understand that signing would prevent her from discussing neighborhood activities with outsiders or participating in any actions that might affect property values. It was a carefully crafted gag order, disguised as community regulation. Henry Walsh received the most sophisticated approach. A representative from a major construction company arrived with plans for a neighborhood-wide infrastructure improvement project that would require temporary relocation of several residents. The compensation offered was generous, enough to allow Henry to retire comfortably in a better neighborhood. "Of course, the project timeline depends on resolving any outstanding issues with property documentation," the representative explained. "Residents who cooperate with the preparation process will receive priority consideration and enhanced compensation packages." Henry studied the plans, recognizing the same manipulative tactics he had witnessed 40 years earlier. "What kind of property documentation issues are you referring to?" "Historical surveys, boundary disputes, that sort of thing. Sometimes old paperwork creates confusion that needs to be cleared up before modern development can proceed." Residents, with helpful insights into past irregularities, might find themselves well compensated for their cooperation. Despite the pressure, the network of resistance that had formed around Emma and Max's innocent friendship proved more resilient than Blackstone had anticipated. Tom Bradley's journalistic instincts had led him to prepare for exactly this kind of retaliation. Before publishing anything, he had secured copies of all evidence with colleagues at larger newspapers and had contacted federal authorities who specialized in corruption cases. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. David Sterling, Blackstone's former business partner, had been monitoring the situation from a distance, waiting to see how the investigation would develop. Sterling had his own reasons for wanting Blackstone's empire to crumble. He had been cheated out of millions when their partnership dissolved, and he possessed records that could corroborate everything the Millbrook Heights Group had discovered. Sterling's approach was direct. He called Tom Bradley and arranged a meeting at a downtown cafe, bringing with him a briefcase full of documents that painted an even more damning picture of Blackstone's operations. "I kept these as insurance," he explained, spreading contracts and correspondence across the table. "Richard thought he could force me out and keep all the profits from our joint ventures. He didn't realize I had been documenting his fraudulent practices for years." The documents revealed that Blackstone's real estate empire was built on a foundation of systematic fraud that went far beyond simple property line disputes. Shell companies, forged documents, bribed officials, and intimidated victims created a network of deception that had generated hundreds of millions in illegal profits. "The Millbrook Heights properties are just his latest target," Sterling continued. "He's been planning to displace the entire neighborhood for a commercial development project. The surveyor's marker your security guard found was part of an ongoing effort to justify seizing additional land through fraudulent boundary claims." Tom realized they were looking at evidence of what could become one of the largest real estate fraud cases in California history. But he also understood that Blackstone's resources and connections would make prosecution extremely difficult unless they could present an overwhelming case that couldn't be dismissed or suppressed. Back in the neighborhood, Max continued his daily escapes, but now his behavior seemed more purposeful than playful. The German Shepherd had begun bringing small objects to Sarah's gate: pieces of metal, fragments of old documents, even what appeared to be torn photographs. Each item seemed deliberately chosen, as if the dog understood that evidence was needed and was trying to help gather it. Emma's delight at these offerings never diminished, but Sarah began collecting the items that Max brought, recognizing that they might be significant. Some of the document fragments contained letterheads from government offices, while others showed partial signatures and official seals. It was as if decades of buried evidence was literally surfacing through Max's determined excavations. The pressure on all sides was intensifying. Blackstone's attempts at intimidation were becoming more aggressive, while the evidence against him continued to mount. Law enforcement agencies were beginning to take serious interest in the case, but their investigation timelines measured in months, while Blackstone's countermeasures were implemented in days. The small group that had stumbled onto this conspiracy found themselves at the center of a battle that would determine not just their own futures, but the fate of countless families who had been victims of Blackstone's fraudulent schemes. The peaceful neighborhood of Millbrook Heights had become ground zero for a confrontation between justice and corruption that would have consequences far beyond its tree-lined streets. As evening approached, each member of their alliance faced the same question: how far were they willing to go to expose the truth, and what price were they prepared to pay for standing up to power that seemed almost limitless in its reach and ruthlessness? The moment of truth arrived on a foggy Thursday morning when Richard Blackstone made a fatal miscalculation. Confident that his intimidation tactics had neutralized the threat, he decided to accelerate his timeline for the Millbrook Heights development project. What he didn't anticipate was that his pressure campaign had actually strengthened the resolve of those opposing him. and attracted the attention of investigators who specialized in exactly the kind of fraud he had been perpetrating. Jake Harrison stood at his bedroom window at dawn, watching unmarked federal vehicles position themselves throughout the neighborhood. His contact at the FBI had finally convinced superiors that the evidence warranted immediate action. But Jake knew that Blackstone's lawyers and political connections would make any investigation extremely challenging. The next few hours would determine whether justice prevailed or whether one of California's most sophisticated fraud operations would escape accountability once again. Tom Bradley had spent the previous night in his newsroom preparing multiple versions of his exposé based on different possible outcomes. His editor, initially skeptical about taking on someone with Blackstone's influence, had been convinced by David Sterling's documentary evidence and the corroborating testimony from multiple witnesses. The story was ready to publish the moment legal authorities gave the all-clear. Sarah Mitchell fed Emma breakfast while keeping one eye on the unusual activity outside their cottage. The baby seemed to sense the tension, pointing repeatedly toward the blue gate where Max usually appeared for their morning visit. But today, the German shepherd was nowhere to be seen, and Sarah wondered if Blackstone had finally succeeded in containing his most persistent escape artist. What none of them knew was that Max had not been contained. He had been set free by Maggie O'Brien in a desperate gambit to ensure the truth would survive whatever happened next. The housekeeper had made her decision during a sleepless night, realizing that accepting Blackstone's bribe would make her complicit in decades of suffering inflicted on innocent families. Before dawn, she had unlocked Max's kennel and led him to the mansion's garden, specifically to the area where his digging had first uncovered the surveyor's marker. "Find it, boy," she whispered, pointing to a spot where she had noticed disturbed earth during her years of managing the household. "Find what Frank wanted us to discover." Max seemed to understand the urgency in her voice. His powerful paws worked methodically, his natural instincts guided by an intelligence that had always impressed Maggie. Within minutes, his digging had exposed what appeared to be a waterproof container, buried deliberately and marked with symbols that Maggie recognized as Frank's careful notation system. Inside the container, wrapped in multiple layers of protective plastic, was Frank's insurance policy, the complete documentation of every fraudulent transaction Blackstone had conducted during his ownership of the estate. The old groundskeeper had been more than just a witness to the corruption. He had been systematically collecting evidence for decades, waiting for the right moment to expose the truth. The files revealed that Blackstone's fraud extended far beyond property boundaries. He had been creating false environmental reports to avoid costly remediation, forging historical preservation documents to bypass zoning restrictions, and using shell companies to hide ownership of properties acquired through illegal means. Most shocking of all, the documents showed that several local government officials had been receiving regular payments in exchange for approving permits and overlooking obvious irregularities. Maggie photographed every page with trembling hands, uploading the images to a secure email account that Tom Bradley had provided for exactly this purpose. As she worked, she could hear Blackstone's voice echoing from the mansion, demanding to know why his security systems weren't functioning properly and ordering his staff to locate the German shepherd immediately. Meanwhile, Henry Walsh had made his own contribution to the investigation. His 40-year-old construction records, combined with contemporary geological surveys, proved definitively that Blackstone's property claims were impossible. The soil composition, foundation requirements, and drainage patterns documented in Henry's files contradicted every survey that Blackstone had submitted to support his boundary expansions. The elderly contractor had driven to the FBI field office, before sunrise, carrying boxes of documentation that he had preserved in his garage for 4 decades. "I should have spoken up years ago," he told the agents, his voice heavy with regret. "But I kept thinking someone else would notice the irregularities. I kept believing the system would catch up with him eventually." Federal agent Maria Santos, who'd been investigating white-collar crime for 15 years, recognized immediately that Henry's documentation provided the historical foundation needed to prosecute Blackstone successfully. "You did speak up," she assured him. "You preserved the evidence we needed to prove this case. Without these records, a man like Blackstone might have continued his operations indefinitely." Back at the estate, Blackstone's composure was finally cracking under the pressure of events spiraling beyond his control. His legal team had warned him that federal investigators were asking questions about his business practices, and his political allies were suddenly too busy to take his calls. The network of corruption that had protected him for so long was beginning to abandon him as word spread that he was under serious investigation. David Sterling's defection had been particularly damaging. Sterling not only possessed incriminating documents, but he could testify to Blackstone's methods from personal experience. His cooperation with investigators provided insights into Blackstone's psychological profile that helped agents understand how to anticipate his likely responses to pressure. Richard always believed he was smarter than everyone else, Sterling had explained to Agent Santos. He thought his money and connections made him untouchable, but he also kept detailed records of everything, including evidence that could destroy him. He couldn't resist documenting his victories, even when those documents represented security risks. The truth of Sterling's assessment became apparent when FBI agents executed search warrants simultaneously at Blackstone's estate, his corporate offices, and 3 safe deposit boxes registered under various names. The businessman's obsession with controlling every detail of his operations had led him to create an extensive paper trail that investigators could follow like a roadmap to his crimes. As federal agents surrounded the mansion, Maggie emerged from the garden with Max at her side. Carrying the waterproof container that Frank had hidden years earlier, she walked directly to Agent Santos and handed over the evidence without a word, her 20 years of silence finally broken. Frank Murphy, the former groundskeeper, left instructions that these documents should be given to law enforcement if anything happened to him or if the property owner's illegal activities threatened the community, Maggie explained. He spent 2 decades documenting everything he witnessed, knowing that someday the truth would need to be told. Sarah Mitchell watched from her cottage as the dramatic scene unfolded across the street. Emma pointed excitedly at Max, who had returned to his familiar position by the blue gate despite the chaos surrounding the estate. The baby's laughter provided a surreal soundtrack to the collapse of one of California's most elaborate criminal enterprises. Tom Bradley arrived with his camera crew just as federal agents began removing boxes of evidence from the mansion. His story would run in the evening edition with the headline, "Millbrook Heights, How a Dog's Friendship Exposed Decades of Real Estate Fraud." But even he didn't yet understand the full scope of what had been uncovered. The documents that Max had helped unearth would eventually expose corruption in 12 California counties, involving over 200 fraudulent property transactions and more than 50 public officials who had accepted bribes. The investigation would lead to federal racketeering charges, the largest real estate fraud prosecution in state history, and the recovery of millions of dollars for victims who had lost their homes to Blackstone's schemes. But in that moment, as federal agents read Richard Blackstone his rights on the front steps of his mansion, the most important victory was smaller and more personal. Emma's friendship with Max had survived. The neighborhood's peace was being restored, and a community that had been targeted for destruction was finding its voice. The German shepherd, oblivious to his role in bringing down a criminal empire, settled contentedly beside Emma's stroller, accepting gentle pats from the baby who had never doubted that her furry friend was special. Justice had been served not through complex legal strategies or sophisticated investigative techniques, but through the simple courage of ordinary people who refused to let corruption triumph over truth. As the fog lifted from Millbrook Heights, revealing a neighborhood forever changed, but finally free from the shadow of Richard Blackstone's influence, a new chapter was beginning for everyone whose lives had been touched by this extraordinary story. 6 months after Richard Blackstone's arrest, Millbrook Heights had transformed completely. The high walls surrounding the former estate had been torn down, replaced by a community garden where neighbors worked together, their children playing among vegetables and flowers that grew in soil once tainted by deception. Sarah Mitchell watched. Emma toddled between the tomato rows with confident steps. Max trotted beside her, now officially adopted by Sarah when the estate's assets were liquidated. The German shepherd had gained celebrity status as the dog whose innocent friendship had exposed one of California's largest fraud conspiracies. "Hard to believe this is the same place," commented Maggie O'Brien, planting marigolds in what had once been Blackstone's private courtyard. At 63, she had discovered a passion for community organizing. The federal witness protection stipend had allowed her to purchase a cottage 2 blocks away, finally free from the constant tension that had defined her years in service. The sad legal proceedings had dominated local news for months, revealing corruption throughout Southern California's real estate industry. Over 40 people had been indicted, including county supervisors and bank officials who had facilitated fraudulent loans. Tom Bradley's investigative reporting had earned him a Pulitzer Prize nomination. His book about the case, The German Shepherd's Justice, became a bestseller, with proceeds funding a foundation providing legal assistance to fraud victims. Jake Harrison now worked as a fraud investigator for the Treasury Department, his courage and investigative skills having attracted federal attention. Henry Walsh, at 74, consulted with law enforcement agencies, his preserved records crucial for proving fraudulent property claims. The federal investigation had recovered millions in stolen funds, allowing unprecedented investment in affordable housing and community infrastructure. Victims received compensation and had their properties restored, while legal precedents made similar fraud operations much more difficult. The Blackstone estate was converted into a community center, serving the neighborhood it had once dominated. The basement storage room, where crucial evidence was found, became a small museum dedicated to preserving historical records. Emma's second birthday party was held in the community garden, celebrating both her milestone and the community's transformation. Agent Maria Santos attended with her children, reflecting on how remarkable it was that such simple beginnings had exposed such widespread corruption. For the residents of Millbrook Heights, the most important changes were personal. Children played freely in streets no longer dominated by security cameras. Neighbors knew each other's names and gathered regularly for community meetings where everyone's voice mattered. Sarah had found more than safety in Millbrook Heights. She had discovered a community that felt like family. Her writing for Tom's newspaper had grown into a full-time position covering local affairs. The cottage with the blue gate was no longer just a refuge, but the center of a life filled with purpose and hope. As autumn approached, neighbors gathered for community potlucks impossible during Blackstone's reign of fear. Emma toddled among the guests, accepting gentle attention from neighbors who had watched her grow. Max followed protectively, understanding his most important job was ensuring one little girl felt safe and loved. Maggie marveled at how courage multiplied when shared. Among neighbors, Her decision to break 20 years of silence had created extraordinary change, proving that ordinary people could stand up to corruption when they supported each other. The transformation was complete through hundreds of small acts of courage, kindness, and commitment to justice. Emma would grow up in a neighborhood where her voice mattered, where bonds between neighbors were stronger than walls, and where her friendship with Max would be remembered as proof that love and loyalty could overcome fear and corruption. As stars appeared over the community garden where Blackstone's walls had once cast shadows, the residents looked forward to a future built on foundations of truth, justice, and their commitment to each other's well-being and dignity. Fim da Historia. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Emma, Max, and the brave residents of Millbrook Heights has moved and inspired you. Their journey reminds us that even the smallest acts of courage can expose the greatest injustices, and that communities united by truth and compassion are stronger than any individual driven by greed and deception. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to our channel where we bring you new tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things every single day. Click the like button to help us reach more listeners who need to hear stories of hope and justice triumphing over corruption and fear. Share your own thoughts and experiences in the comments below. We love hearing how these stories connect with your own lives and communities. Don't miss our upcoming stories that explore the complexities of modern life, the power of human connection, and the endless possibilities for positive change when people choose courage over comfort. You can find our special playlist of similar inspiring stories by clicking to your left, each one carefully selected to remind you that heroes walk among us every day, often disguised as neighbors, friends, and even family pets. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey, and remember, your voice matters, your actions count, and your community is stronger because you're part of it. We'll see you in the comments, and we can't wait to share more powerful stories with you soon. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Emma, Max, and the brave residents of Millbrook Heights has moved and inspired you. Their journey reminds us that even the smallest acts of courage can expose the greatest injustices, and that communities united by truth and compassion are stronger than any individual driven by greed and deception. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to our channel, where we bring you new tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things every single day. Click the like button to help us reach more listeners who need to hear stories of hope and justice, triumphing over corruption and fear. Share your own thoughts and experiences in the comments below. We love hearing how these stories connect with your own lives and communities. Don't miss our upcoming stories that explore the complexities of modern life, the power of human connection, and the endless possibilities for positive change when people choose courage over comfort. You can find our special playlist of similar inspiring stories by clicking to your left, each one carefully selected to remind you that heroes walk among us every day, often disguised as neighbors, friends, and even family pets. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey, and remember, your voice matters, your actions count, and your community is stronger because you're part of it. We'll see you in the comments, and we can't wait to share more powerful stories with you soon.